If you plan to pull for Kafka, you're going to need to know and understand dot mechanics. DOT can definitely be a bit confusing. I know it was for me at one point, and so I'm here to share all of the knowledge that I've gathered around dot mechanics. So first off, what is considered DOT or dot? Damage over time. There are only 4 statuses that are considered to deal dot damage: burn, shock, wind shear, and bleed. Dot does not include entanglement, freeze, or imprisonment. These can actually be found in the tutorial section of the game, but this was a long time ago. So there's absolutely no blame to anyone that doesn't remember these very specific interactions. The language that's used in these descriptions are also very specific. So when we all first started out, there's definitely no way we could have fully understood this. Quantum and freeze intuitively seem like they would be considered DOTs, but alas, they are not. If we take a look at the description for them, it says that it will immediately deal quantum damage and apply entanglement status. It will cause the enemies to have their action delayed and take additional quantum damage at the start of the turn. For ice, it's also similar, additional ice damage at the start of the turn. We compare that to wind, lightning, fire, or physical, and we'll see that it very specifically says that bleed will cause enemies to take physical DOT. Likewise with fire, lightning, and wind. This is also further evidenced by the nihility path in the simulated universe. Using the resonance path action only applies burn, shock, wind shear, or bleed. So although entanglement and freeze are not DOTs, they are weakness break status effects. And so that might be where the confusion is stemming from. And this leads into the next point. There are generally 2 types of DOTs: weakness break dot and dot from character skills. In the Star Rail community, they've been dubbed normal dot versus break dot. And it's important to separate these two because the way their damage gets calculated is pretty different. So let's go ahead and start with normal DOTs. What affects the damage output of normal dots, or DOTs that come from skills from a character's kit, i.e. Serval or Sampo? Well, normal DOTs behave very similarly to regular skills that deal standard damage, like most other characters. It's affected by elemental damage bonus or universal/global damage bonuses. These are things like planar spheres, as long as the damage bonus corresponds to the type of dot. So for Serval, for example, since she applies lightning dot, only a lightning planar sphere would increase the damage of her lightning DOTs. Light cones that give global damage bonuses or very specific DOT damage bonuses. Example being Eyes of Prey that will increase DOT damage by 36%. As well as the Seriousness of Breakfast giving the wearer's damage an extra 15% damage bonus. There are many types of these damage bonuses, and there are just way too many for me to name them all. Next is enemy defense, which is largely determined by the difference in your character's level and the enemy's level. You can decrease the enemy's defense using tons of abilities in the game, namely Pela's ult or Silverwolf's ultimate. Enemy resistance will affect your DOT damage as well, so keep in mind their weaknesses and resistances. If they are weak to the element, then you will deal 20% more damage, approximately, and if they are resistant to the element, you will deal approximately 20% less damage. Res penetration is another way to increase your DOT damage. Not many characters have this ability. Characters like Dan Heng, Zila have this baked into their kits, as well as one of Yanqing's Eidolons. However, those characters don't really have DOTs on their skills, so it doesn't really apply. It will, however, apply when it comes to their weakness break dots, but that'll come later on in the video. Res penetration is very similar to reducing an enemy's elemental res, but it's not exactly the same. It's all baked into the whole enemy resistance calculation part, but all you need to know is that having res penetration will increase your DOT damage, if a character has it. The next one is vulnerability. You can tell that an ability is vulnerability if it says something along the lines of increases damage taken. Examples being Himiko's technique. There is a 100% base chance to increase fire damage taken by enemies by 10% for 2 turns. Another one is Sampo's ultimate, 100% base chance to increase the target's DOT taken by 24%. And then Welt's ultimate, there is a 100% base chance to increase the damage received by the targets by 12% for 2 turns. Himiko's and Sampo's were very specific types of damage, but welts is a universal type of damage. Himiko's only applied to fire, and Sampo's only applied to dots. But these are all examples of vulnerability and are ways to increase DoT damage. And the last thing that affects DoT damage is the toughness multiplier. Basically, if the enemy is weakness broken, you will deal 10% more damage. And then the last thing to know is that dots cannot crit. No matter how hard you try, they will never ever crit. This is also stated in the tutorial section. Damage dealt by bleed, burn, shock, and wind shear is considered DoT. This damage cannot crit hit. And break effect will not improve DoT damage. At least DoT damage that comes from a character's kit, aka normal DoT. This might not be clear to some, especially if we don't play DoT characters, and we may have associated DoT with weakness break. And so I can understand the confusion on why some may think break effect will increase the damage of DoTs from Serval's shock or Sampo's wind shear. But alas, break effect will not improve that dot damage. Break effect will only increase the dot damage if the DoT was inflicted by weakness break, which leads us into the next part, what affects the damage of weakness break dot. This time around, any damage bonuses that you have will not increase the damage of weakness break dot. Any planar spheres, damage bonuses from light cones and abilities do not apply here. For example, the Good Night and Sleep Well light cone will increase the damage dealt by the wearer by a certain percent for every debuff the enemy has, up to 3 times, and also applies to the DoT. This will not apply to weakness break dot. Same goes for the Eyes of Prey light cone. This increases dot by 36%, will not increase the damage of weakness break dot. This goes for any kind of damage bonus. However, everything else will affect the damage just like normal dot. Defense, enemy res, ally res penetration, vulnerability, and toughness. They all will affect weakness break dot just the same as normal dot. So what then is the main source that determines the damage of your weakness break dot? It is your character's level that determines the damage from break dot. Put simply, the higher the level of your character, the more break dot your character will deal. There's an entire table that determines the base damage for it. Feel free to pause the video if you want to take a look at this. The break effect stat here will increase the damage of your break dots. A 50% increase in break effect can increase your dot damage by about 50%, and this scales pretty much linearly, if not considering any other kinds of debuffs or boosts. Basically what that means is that, for example, if you have a 100% break effect, your dot damage will increase by 100%. If you have 150%, then your dot damage will increase by 150%. So to reiterate, break effect will only increase the damage of your break dots and not your normal dots that come from a character's skills and abilities. So let's try to summarize everything. Normal dots are affected by one of the character's base stats and damage bonus. The dot will specify which stat it scales off of. Currently in the game right now, most characters will scale their dots off of the attack stat. There's only one other DoT in the game right now that scales off of a different stat, which is defense, and that comes from a light cone. Trend of the universal market will deal dot based off of the wearer's defense instead. So perhaps in the future, maybe dot can scale off of HP. Normal dots are not affected by break effect percent. On the other hand, break dots are affected by the character's level and break effect percent. Break dots are not affected by damage bonuses. And then all dots are affected by defense, enemy resistance, vulnerability multipliers, and whether the enemy's toughness is broken or not. Have you ever wondered how to tell if a dot comes from a break or from a skill? Well, I've kind of noticed that in the wording when taking a look at the enemy status page, it either says beginning or start. And I've noticed that when the dot comes from weakness break, the wording says the beginning of the turn. And when it comes from a skill, it says start of the turn. That's one way, at least I hope. If someone has seen something different, let me know down in the comments. But everything I've seen so far, this is how it's been. And it's a very easy way to associate because B, beginning, is for break, and S, start, correlates with skill. So that's how I remember it. Additionally, weakness break dot is actually not a guaranteed application onto the enemy when you weakness break them. It is actually only a 100% base chance, which means it's not exactly guaranteed if the enemy has high resistance. Dots are also considered debuffs and can be applied simultaneously, Going back to the light cone, good night and sleep well. It deals more damage based on the number of debuffs, so this is important to understand. Each entry of debuff on the enemy's status page counts as one debuff. So for example, this means that if you have 5 stacks of 1 wind shear, that is not considered 5 debuffs. It is considered one single debuff. So just look at this here to know the exact number of debuffs. You can also apply multiple wind shear, multiple shocks, multiple burns onto an enemy, no problem at all. The exception is that they need to be a different type of shock. So for example, it can be from weakness break, it can come from a skill, or it can come from different characters. So for example, you can have multiple burns on an enemy as long as they all come from a different character. If you have Asta, Himiko, and Hook on one team, all of them can apply their burns. But for example, for Serval, she can only apply one type of shock from her skills. Her ultimate and her skill and her talent are all the same type of shock. I have a little bit more information on weakness break and DoT that goes a little bit more in depth. So if you're interested in that, I'll leave the video on the screen now.